In this lesson, we'll apply what we've learned about how to refer to a text. We'll read a story and answer questions using the story, and then we'll repeat and do the same thing with a poem. Let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1, A Stomach Pain. When Kara was sitting in art class, she felt a weird pain in her stomach. She didn't want to get in trouble for getting out of her seat, but she didn't want to raise her hand and tell everyone that she had a stomachache. She slowly got out of her seat and walked to her art teacher. Her art teacher told her she shouldn't be out of her seat, but Kara told her she needed to go to the nurse. Chapter 2, A Trip to the Nurse. Kara walked slowly down the hallway to the nurse's office. She didn't want to walk too fast. When she got to the nurse's office, the nurse was helping a little boy with a scrape on his knee. Kara laid down on the nurse's bed while she waited. It was finally Kara's turn. The nurse asked her a couple of questions about when her last meal was and what food she had eaten. Kara thought about her breakfast. She realized she never ate any breakfast. The nurse said that maybe Kara was just hungry, so she gave her some crackers and let her lay down. In about 10 minutes, Kara's belly no longer hurt. She was just really hungry. She knew she'd never skip breakfast again. Now that we've read the story, let's read the questions, and we'll come back to the story to answer them. Question number 1. Underline the part of the text that describes why Kara didn't want to tell her teacher first. I think that was in the part about a stomachache. So why didn't she want to tell her teacher about the stomachache at first? Let's take a minute and look at the passage. Here in the second sentence, it says, she didn't want to get in trouble for getting out of her seat, but she didn't want to raise her hand and tell everyone that she had a stomachache. I'm going to highlight that part because that helps me to understand why Kara didn't want to tell her teacher at first about why she had a stomachache. Question number 2. Underline the part of the text that describes how the nurse figured out what was wrong. If it's in the part about the nurse, I know that's in chapter 2 because that was all about her trip to the nurse. The question again. Underline the part of the text that describes how the nurse figured out what was wrong. How did the nurse figure out what was wrong? Pause the video and look at the story. Here in chapter 2, it says, the nurse asked her a couple of questions about when her last meal was and what she had eaten. That's how the nurse started to solve the problem and understand what was really going on with Kara. Question number 3. In which chapter did Kara learn her lesson? So in chapter 1, did Kara learn her lesson about how she could prevent herself from getting sick in the future? Or is it in chapter 2? I remember at the very end of the story, it says, she knew she'd never skip breakfast again. And that is in chapter 2. So Kara learned her lesson about eating breakfast in chapter 2. Let's look at the next question. In which chapter did Kara begin to solve the problem? So when I look at the story, I remember that Kara had the stomachache in chapter 1, and then she goes to the nurse in chapter 2. Our question again, in which chapter did Kara begin to solve the problem? So that's the start of solving the problem. Here at the very end of chapter 1, it says, Kara told her she needed to go to the nurse. That means that in chapter 1, Kara started to solve her problem about not feeling well in the story. Let's look at the next question. In which chapter did Kara realize she had a problem? At the very beginning of chapter 1, it says, when Kara was sitting in art class, she felt a weird pain in her stomach. The question asks, in which chapter did Kara realize she had a problem? When she realizes that she has a stomach ache, that's her realizing that she has a problem. Also, the chapter is titled A Stomach Pain. So Kara realized that she had a problem in chapter 1. Let's look at the next question. Where in the text does it explain what was really wrong with Kara? So I remember when we were reading the story that in chapter 1, where it's more about us finding out that she has a problem and how Kara addresses it with her teacher. In chapter 2 is where the problem starts to get solved. So again, the question that we're answering, where in the text does it explain what was really wrong with Kara? So here I highlighted the part about the nurse asking Kara what was the problem, and then shortly after it says, she realized she never ate any breakfast. That's where Kara realizes what was really wrong with her. I'll go ahead and highlight that. Now let's look at a poem. We'll do the same thing with the poem that we did with the story before. Let's start by reading the poem. What I wish. I wish I was older so I could go to work. I'd make lots of money to buy myself a shirt. I wish that I were older so I could buy a car. I'd drive my car all day until I was very far. I wish that I were older. Cars and jobs seem neat, but living with mom and dad really can't be beat. Let's look at some questions and use the poem to help us answer those questions. In which stanza does the writer want to drive? I see this key word of drive. I wonder if that'll help me find the answer. As I look through the poem, I see the word drive. So that means I drive my car all day. That means that in the second stanza, this would be stanza 2, the author discusses wanting to drive a car. Let's look at the next question. Where in the text does the writer mention a job? So when I look at the poem, I'm going to look for the word job. Here is the word job. So in the third stanza is where the writer discusses wanting a job. Let's look at the next question. What is this poem about? Take a minute, pause the video, and think for yourself. What is the author writing about? All right, hopefully you've taken your think time. This whole poem is just wishes. The kid wanting to be older, the kid wanting to be older, and the kid wanting to be older. But then in the end, he also says that living with mom and dad can't be beat. So it's just about wishes. Let's look at the next question. Underline the line or lines in the poem that repeat what the writer wants. Right here, the writer wants to go to work. And right here, the writer's talking about wanting a job. So those are the two things that the writer talks about that they want. Let's look at one more question together. Underline the line or lines in the poem that describes what he would do if he had a car. Well, I know the second stanza was about wanting a car. So I'm going to read the second stanza. I'll give you some think time. What would the author do if he had a car? Go ahead and pause the video. The second stanza reads, I wish that I were older so I could buy a car. I'd drive my car all day until I was very far. So if the author had a car, they would drive it all day and they would be very far away at the end of the day. Great job.